Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we'll take a look at the ideas of freedom of thought and of morality through a brief summary of about 350 years of philosophical development in the West. The reading for this lecture is The Eclipse of Thought, Chapter 1 of Michael Polanyi's book, Meaning. Having already covered some topics in ethics as well as some questions on society, it is rather useful to see how philosophical ideas on these issues play out in human history. It's all too easy to dismiss philosophical ideas as just pie-in-the-sky thinking that is unrelated to anything practical. But a careful analysis shows us that it is precisely these ideas that have shaped the very history and nature of our reality. The violent deaths of over 250 million people in the 20th century come as a direct result of such ideas. The near destruction of the planet during the Cold War came from the same source. Yes, philosophy really can kill people. While Polanyi starts the chapter with John Locke, one of the main founders of Western political thought, we will actually begin just a bit earlier with Descartes. And this is because it was Descartes that introduced a major axiomatic assumption into Western thought, and the effects of that assumption played a significant part in the problem that Polanyi notes. Before we get started, we should make one additional note. Traditionally speaking, science has been the activity of understanding the world mechanics, the pursuit of which was guided by metaphysical values and guided in the direction of being useful and valuable as specified by that metaphysical system. In essence, science was the way we tackle the problems placed before us by the metaphysics. The whole realm of science was understood to be a child of human reason and ingenuity, to be deployed in the service of the metaphysics as the master. Metaphysics gave us the function, the why. Science provided the power, the how. However, modern ideas threw a rather sizable wrench into that system. For proof and reference, see the links in the cards on screen and check out Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Well then, let's get started. Starting with Descartes, the notion of science changed. Descartes argued for a purely quantitative analysis of the world. Why? Well, because we may disagree on whether this table is a good table, but we don't disagree about its dimensions, its weight, and so on. This led to a materialistic reduction of the world. That is to say, the only things that are real are things that can be quantitatively described, that is, weighed and measured. However, as soon as we take that approach, we run into a problem. Human beings are just as reducible to material components as that table. And although that step would take a few more centuries to kick in, suddenly you're no different than a cow, except in quantitative volume. And we can eat cows. Why can't we eat babies? All value judgments, being metaphysical, would have to fall apart. To use a modern understanding, all things are made up of atoms, and atoms are made up of subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. And all subatomic particles are made up of quarks, and you and cows and the sun are all made up of the exact same stuff. And worse, we can't attach a moral or a value claim anywhere. How do you give the right to life to this pile of quarks, but not to that one? Where exactly do you attach moral value? To protons? Again, it would be a long while before this idea really moved away from math and geometry and some hard sciences to everything else. But this was the sort of danger that no one, Descartes included, noticed was lurking in the background of their ideas. On to the text itself. Polanyi offers us a history of Western thought and its impact on political development from Locke onwards. And in short, the story goes something like this. While attempting to smooth over the basis for various religious conflicts in Europe, like torture and murder of Catholics in England, John Locke came up with the concept of religious toleration. And that argument is as follows. It is not reasonable to force a person to believe anything that reasonable people can reasonably disagree about. What we can reasonably disagree about is anything that doesn't have hard proof, like mathematics. And thus, when it comes to religion, reasonable people can disagree on whether Catholicism or Protestantism, or which variety of Protestantism or any other religion for that matter, is true. How so? Well, that's because there is no hard proof for either side. Things like math, on the other hand, really do have hard proof. So imagine you walk into a 7-Eleven and you buy a $1 item. You pay with a $5 bill. The cashier gives you back $1 in change. So you ask for the rest of it, and the cashier tells you that he believes that 5 minus 1 is 1. Now at that point you can go ahead and call the police, and when they show up, the police will enforce math. Now, that sounds like a great way of ensuring that we have some basis for social agreement, but it comes at a cost. Every single moral and value claim we have is actually based on belief, not on hard proof. So if you're using Locke's argument for religious and moral toleration, you have to accept every kind of moral value claim as being equally good and equally bad. There is no actual objective good and bad. Take the claim that human life is the kind of thing that should be protected. Can you demonstrate that's true? No, you cannot. You have to take it as a metaphysical idea, and no metaphysical idea is better than any other metaphysical idea because none are based on hard proof. So the argument that human life is the kind of thing that should be destroyed is just as good and should be just as accepted. Now, obviously, Locke did not intend this cascade, and he could manage to retain morality and values because the world at the time believed in telos. And telos, if you recall, is the idea that there is a goal, design, and purpose to all things. And so, even without a moral anchor provided by some traditional moral theory, he could have argued that self-destruction was bad because it goes against the telos of humanity. Or he could have argued that we should have a society because social belonging is part of human telos, and so on. So we start off by trying to push for the idea of intellectual freedom and for reason. But the setup carried the implication that anything that cannot be objectively justified cannot be enforced, and so it must be tolerated, and it is to be given the same value as its opposite. Of course, ethical claims cannot be objectively justified, and neither can the use of reason. See our lecture on the El-Ghazali for proof, link in the card. And this means that the reason why toleration should be accepted, because of the value of intellectual freedom, cannot be justified. And that means that its opposite, the destruction of intellectual freedom and the use of reason, as well as absolutely murderous intolerance, is just as good. Obviously, the various philosophers did not make this connection immediately. And this all happens in the period of enlightenment, which has already started to strip off any teleological understanding of man. And since Descartes, that by the way 1650, the quantitative and materialistic interpretation of humanity had been gaining momentum. A bit while later, as these ideas get worked out, we start to get a purely material human being, with no direction, no purpose, no ability to discern right from wrong, because there is no right and wrong, because one is as good as the other. And then Polanyi says Darwin and post-Darwinism hits. Now, contrary to popular belief, the problem with Darwinism is not the man from Abe hypothesis. It was instead the idea that the entire system runs not on design, goal, and direction, which would be telos, but on pure, blind chance. And that means that all meaning gets stripped out of the world. It's no longer headed anywhere. There is no longer a right and a wrong way to be human. There is no longer a goal, no longer a purpose, no longer anything. We were nowhere in particular, and we were headed nowhere. There was no basis for distinguishing good and bad except in power. Darwin's idea was the ultimate argument for every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost, and telos was dead. And to top it all off, the idea of reason as a higher authority got killed off in the process. Science, that child of human reason and ingenuity, was no longer subservient to that reason, because there was no reason to be. Instead, it overthrew reason, and now reason would be subject to scientific claims. That is quite literally completely backwards. As a result, the metaphysical function of science was gone and all that was left was power. And to quote Immortal Technique, self-destruction is power without knowing what the function is. Power without function, direction, and goal is the nuclear button in the hands of a monkey. There is no reason why science should be directed towards social good, given that we have no idea what that good is. So wiping us all out is just as good as curing cancer. There is no social metaphysical highest moral value. There is nowhere to collectively aim at, except perhaps at more power, because might makes right. And so the function of science in society had undergone this radical transformation and had changed the very nature of society in the process. Now, to continue with the philosophical trends, Hegel comes in with the historical dialectic, which gives us the idea of progress, but it negates the individual and it justifies evil. He's still sort of using a concept of telos here. Marx turns Hegelian process the right way up, and instead of being dragged forward into process, as Hegel says happens, we make progress by force and violence. So telos is now gone, and Marx is pushing for a kind of might makes right attitude on the premise that once equality is reached, a utopia will arise. Nietzsche takes the sum of these ideas and then rejects the entire notion of morality which had been sold for 2,000 plus years, and instead he argues that only the strong really live, and that the strong, in their power, are actually the source of all actual values. Everybody else is just part of the herd that does nothing but seek to revenge themselves on the world by tearing it all down. The nihilism that had grown in Europe with the rejection of meaning, of values, of human telos, had left people dejected and lost and incapable of orienting their lives in any direction because, quite frankly, there was nothing left to orient towards. Meanwhile, we were told that it is only human ignorance that causes suffering, and with the removal of religion and the advance of science, utopia was just around the corner. Then, according to Polanyi, Marxism caught the attention of the nihilistic crowd. Their nihilism, plus Marxism, with a bit of Nietzsche's will to power, gave these people a sense of renewal. It gave them this access to a secret knowledge about the world. It's all a sham. It's all about power. And on a national level, it is all about national destiny. Hitler presents this idea in its most clear sense when he argues that the powerful have only gained power through all the things considered evil. Once they gained that power, however, they turned around and began preaching peace and diplomacy, and that's just to protect themselves against others doing the exact same thing that got the powerful into power. That is, this entire morality shtick is a lie that the powerful use to hold on to their power. In the Marxist state, the same notion is presented from a slightly different Marxist angle. The oppressors are the only reason that we have not yet ushered in an era of perpetual peace and a veritable utopia. And all that's needed is just a little bit of murderous violence directed at the oppressors, and the utopia is ours for the taking. All that wonderful scientific advancement that promised a utopia turned towards the murderous aims of the fascists on the right and Marxists on the left. Funny how the ideologies on the complete opposite ends of the spectrum seem to end up with the same ideas. World wars then shattered the illusion of a hopeful future and showed science for what it was, a tool that does the bidding of whoever holds it. A cure for polio? Yes. VX nerve gas? Yes. It's not a magical utopia-making system. It's a system for developing ideas. The person coming up with the ideas is what matters. Now notice here that the idea that Descartes gave us found full bloom in a combination of Darwin's rejection of telos plus nihilism. Being no different than animals, the same evolutionary idea of power for the win seemed to be the necessary next step. And both Nazis and Marxists took the idea of intellectual liberty to its logical conclusion. If one side is as good as another, then there is no purpose in intellectual freedom. There is no morality, there is only raw power. It was an understanding of the world perfectly in line with Darwinian ideas, and it almost destroyed our species several times over. And the problem which Polanyi alludes to is that the historical development of philosophical thought led to the destruction of ideas regarded as traditional values. These values included an objective moral standard. They included the value of intellectual liberty. They included the value of human life, of property, of all the things we tend to think of as crucial for having a society of any kind. The initial thinkers like Locke had assumed that the ideas of morality and intellectual liberty were ideas that we all inherently shared. That is, these ideas were not dependent on the source of other values in their societies, most often religious ones. And so they assumed that they could do away with the source of the values, but keep the morality and intellectual liberty. And it turns out that does not work. Morality and intellectual liberty are values, and all values need to be anchored in something or they can be done away with. Think back to our reading of Plato's Republic with the divisions made between the kinds of good there are. There are things that are good in themselves, things good in themselves and for a benefit, and then there are disagreeable things that we only do because they provide us with a benefit, like dieting. Now, anything that's used simply for its benefit is not a thing that we want. We only want the results. So as soon as we can get around that unpleasant activity, we will. The issue that arises here is that intellectual freedom and morality became things that were no longer good in themselves. They were good only for achieving other goals. And so as soon as we were able to get rid of them, as soon as their cost was higher than their benefit, we ditched them. Marxists and Nazis use intellectual freedom as a way to climb to the top, and then they throw away the ladder because it was no longer useful. You want to be able to speak freely and to get your organization started and promoted, but once you're in power, you want to shut up the opposition. So you get rid of intellectual liberty as soon as it no longer benefits you. After removing the traditional sources of these values, their space was left empty. And so society had no support for any of these values, and simply kept using them as a matter of course, driven forward by social inertia. And once that ran out, once it became clear that there was no reason to follow that course of action, and that it would be clearly detrimental to do so, because there is a cost to acting traditionally, but now there is no belief in the payoff, people discarded the pretense of those values, and all hell broke loose. Now, the problem for us and the problem for Polanyi is that following World War II, we did not actually come up with anything like a new set of ideas to support the values that we have, or at least the values that we claim to have. These are still all free-floating and simply waiting to collapse. To give you a simple idea of how unconnected these concepts are, we can consider torture. Torture used to be bad because human sanctity of life and so on, which was based on a traditionally religious standard. Now, of course, torture happened anyway, but there was an argument to actually be made against it. Today, we promise not to torture, but still do so if we feel like it. The only thing that prevents torture is someone else being willing and able to come in and hurt you for torturing. If you have the ability to torture and are either too strong for anyone to attack you, or no one cares, torture equals non-torture. There are no limits. Think of it this way. When we speak of human rights, where do those rights come from? Let's say you point to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Okay, so what? Neither of those is immutable. Neither of those is applicable outside the U.S. Neither of those matters if the government itself decides to infringe upon your human rights. There is no standard external to some Bob or Steve that we can appeal to. And so Polanyi summarizes a problem like this. The downfall of liberty is when it becomes pointless and disappears, which is anywhere that reason and morality are deprived of status as a force in their own right. If morality depends on something else, if intellectual liberty is only there to serve a purpose, then we can get rid of both of them, and we will just as soon as we feel that it is to our advantage to do so. And then there is nothing that we can use as a standard, and everything will go to hell once again. Except this time, we have scientific advancements that will make world wars look like a joke. To quote Einstein, I do not know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And here we come full circle again. The idea of rejecting metaphysics for science and the issue of morality without an external objective basis and so on have left us in a dead end, and there's no meaningful way out, not that anyone can see. Hopefully you're able to appreciate the incredible impact that philosophical ideas have had on our history. Equally, I hope that you can recognize the role of intellectual freedom, free speech, and genuine meaning in ensuring that society does not collapse. As you will see in the next and final module, the problems noted by Polanyi have not actually been resolved. They have rebranded themselves and are playing out in increasingly problematic ways today. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section or email me. Thank you.